Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back into a subject that history textbooks politely avoid, but that medieval people could never escape. The wedding night. Not the chivalric vows in a candlelit chapel, not the banners fluttering above the castle walls, but what came after. The honeymoon, though in truth no one in the Middle Ages ever called it that. To them, it was something far more binding, more public, and in many ways, more humiliating. And as we'll soon discover, the notion of privacy is one of those modern luxuries our ancestors simply did not enjoy. So settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe thank your stars that no one is going to supervise your bedroom routine this evening. Because what we're about to unpack is equal parts scandal, awkward ritual, and a sobering reminder that medieval romance was never quite as romantic as the stories would have you believe. The first thing to understand is that marriage was not about two people finding love. It was about families binding themselves together like ropes knotted over a chest of coin. Every noble marriage was an alliance, and every peasant marriage was an arrangement of labor and land. Love, affection, or even basic compatibility were minor details in the grand ledger of inheritance, which meant that what followed, the consummation, wasn't a private affair. It was evidence, it was proof that the contract had been sealed in flesh. Without it, the marriage could be annulled, and centuries of dowry negotiations or land disputes could come undone in an instant. And so, unlike our glossy modern honeymoons in faraway islands, the medieval honeymoon began in the presence of witnesses. If you were royalty, the scene could be downright theatrical. Picture it. You're 15 years old, perhaps 16 if fate is generous, dressed in brocade heavier than your own limbs, married to a stranger who is now legally your husband. You've just survived hours of feasting, of men shouting toasts, of minstrels plucking strings, of goblets being drained and slammed against wooden tables, and then, as the fire dies low, the crowd turns its eyes toward you. The marriage must be sealed. In France, in England, in the German courts, the process was alarmingly similar. The bride and groom were led to their chamber not alone but in procession. Candles lit the way, musicians sometimes played bawdy tunes, and guests jostled to glimpse the newlyweds as they were deposited into bed. Priests muttered blessings not over the union of souls, but over the act that was about to confirm it. Parents stood near, servants hovered, courtiers whispered. There are even accounts of chroniclers noting whether the bride blushed or whether the groom appeared capable, which is the sort of detail one imagines could ruin any mood. And when the curtains close, if there were curtains, the witnesses did not always leave. In many cases, they lingered at the chamber door, listening for sounds that indicated the marriage was being properly consummated. Some nobles even stationed attendants inside, seated in the corner, quietly present as living notaries of the act. You might be wondering how anyone managed to carry on under such scrutiny. The truth is that many didn't, but the performance of trying, the appearance of fulfilling the contract, was often enough to satisfy the court. After all, the political alliance mattered more than whether the groom was nervous or the bride was terrified. For peasants, the ordeal was no less invasive, just stripped of pomp. There were no velvet curtains, no priests muttering blessings, but neither was there privacy. A peasant hut was often one room, sometimes shared with parents, siblings, or even livestock. To make matters worse, relatives or neighbors sometimes gathered to listen at the door, eager for confirmation that the new couple had done their duty. And if listening was not enough, there was always the matter of the bed linens. In many regions, sheets were inspected the following morning for signs of blood, physical proof that the bride had been a virgin and that the union was valid. If the sheets were suspiciously clean, the consequences could be dire accusations of infidelity, public humiliation, even annulment. The young woman bore the brunt of this scrutiny, her future often decided by what did or did not stain a square of cloth. It was not unusual for those sheets to be displayed, almost like trophies as evidence of a legitimate union. Think about that for a moment. The most private act imaginable transformed into a public relic of honor, waved about by families desperate to prove their new alliance was unshakable. It is the sort of indignity that makes you realize just how little agency medieval couples had over their own marriages. But here is where the story turns even darker. In some places, the wedding night was not even guaranteed to belong to the groom. Medieval law and custom gave rise to a legend known as the droit du seigneur, the lord's right, the supposed privilege of a feudal lord to sleep with a newlywed bride before her husband. Historians debate whether this was widely practiced or merely whispered about to emphasize noble power, but the idea itself speaks volumes about the imbalance of authority in medieval society. Even the sanctity of the marriage bed could be threatened by the whims of a man with more land and soldiers at his command. For ordinary couples, the indignities were quieter but no less cruel. Imagine the weight of expectation on two young people, often strangers, thrust into the most intimate of acts, while their future, their family's fortunes, even their own survival hung in the balance. Failure was not private. Failure could echo across generations, reshaping alliances, staining reputations, or unraveling dowries. The medieval honeymoon was not about pleasure or exploration. It was a test, a ritual, a contract sealed under pressure so immense that it's a wonder anyone survived it with sanity intact. And yet, amid this suffocating atmosphere of duty, there were glimmers of humanity. We know from letters, poems, and court records that couples sometimes did fall in love despite the circumstances. A bride might learn to trust her husband over time. A groom might soften toward the frightened girl thrust into his chamber. They found ways to carve out small moments of tenderness even within a world that refused to grant them privacy. For some, the honeymoon became not just a scandalous ritual of validation, but the hesitant first step into a companionship that might, against all odds, grow into something resembling affection. Still, for most, the medieval honeymoon was less about romance and more about survival. It was the awkward spectacle that everyone pretended was holy. The ordeal endured because society demanded it, the scandal whispered about in corners, but rarely challenged outright. As you lie in your clean bed tonight, doors locked, privacy assured, remember that not so long ago the act of beginning a marriage was a public performance, observed, judged, and catalogued like a transaction in a ledger. And in that performance, the individuals mattered far less than the families who owned them. That was only the beginning. The night itself was just one step in a marriage defined by scandal, control, and the relentless weight of expectation. In the next part, we'll follow the newlyweds beyond the marriage bed into the long shadow of early married life, where privacy remained elusive. Scandal was never far away, and the so-called honeymoon quickly gave way to something much harsher. So the deed, or at least the ceremony of the deed, is done. The bride and groom have endured their first night together, whether in front of witnesses, behind thin curtains, or under the scrutiny of neighbors, waiting to see what the sheets look like in the morning. You might think that after such an ordeal, a young couple would finally be allowed some privacy, some moment to breathe and discover one another. But this was medieval Europe. Privacy was not part of the package, and the honeymoon was not a holiday. It was an ongoing negotiation, a continuation of the contract signed in vows and sealed in flesh. In the days following the wedding, a new wife was expected to prove herself useful immediately. There was no time for gentle discovery, no lazy mornings in bed, no traveling to sunny shores with fruit cocktails. Instead, the bride stepped straight into her new role as wife, which was in truth a role as laborer, servant, and above all, womb. Producing heirs was her primary function. Her health, her happiness, even her youth were secondary concerns. A marriage unconsummated was a failed contract, but a marriage without children was a scandal waiting to explode. The pressure was relentless. Nobles counted the months from the wedding night to the birth of the first child, calculating whether the heir was legitimate. If the baby arrived suspiciously early, tongues wagged about premarital indiscretions. If the baby failed to arrive at all, blame fell on the woman, regardless of whether the husband was uninterested, impotent, or absent. Childlessness was never considered the fault of men, at least not officially. A barren womb was a family crisis. A virile man was always assumed, even if he spent his nights drunk or in the arms of someone else entirely. The honeymoon period, if we stretch the definition, was therefore more about scrutiny than celebration. Families watched closely. Servants reported gossip. Even the church kept an eye on things, ready to intervene with advice ranging from herbal tonics to the laying on of hands, which is a polite way of saying, let's pray harder and hope for the best. Failure to conceive within a year could lead to whispers, accusations, and in some cases, annulments. Imagine the stress of lying in bed each night with that weight pressing down on you. Romance didn't stand much of a chance. But marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't only about producing heirs. It was also about learning how to survive the realities of shared life in a world where resources were scarce, disease rampant, and labor unending. For many young women, the honeymoon was the first time they had left their family homes. Suddenly, they found themselves in a stranger's household, surrounded by in-laws who might be hostile, critical, or openly cruel. A new wife was expected to integrate quickly, to take over chores, to assist in the fields, or, if she was lucky enough to be noble, to manage servants and estates. Her educations in household management began immediately, and mistakes were seldom forgiven. The new husband was not always a source of comfort. Many were equally inexperienced, equally frightened, and equally trapped in marriages they had little say in. Some husbands were kind enough, learning along with their wives, building a cautious partnership over time. Others were harsh, impatient, or violent, quick to assert their authority through dominance in bed or in daily life. The balance of power was rarely equal, and young brides often bore the brunt of their husbands' frustrations. The honeymoon, instead of a period of intimacy, could become a time of adjustment to new hierarchies, new expectations, and new humiliations. And then, of course, there was the constant presence of family. Extended families often lived under the same roof, particularly in noble households. A bride did not move into a quiet home with just her husband. She joined a bustling hall filled with parents, siblings, cousins, retainers, and servants. Every move she made was observed. Every failure was noted. Privacy, again, was a myth. Newlyweds were expected to perform their roles within the watchful eye of an entire household. In some cases, this meant that even their bedroom was not entirely their own. Servants might sleep nearby, ready to fetch water or tend the fire. Gossip about the couple's relations could spread through the household faster than smoke through a thatched roof. Scandal was always lurking, and it did not take much to ignite. A bride who seemed too familiar with a male servant might find herself accused of infidelity. A groom who spent too much time away from home might be suspected of neglect. Rumors were weapons in medieval households, and the honeymoon period was a particularly vulnerable time. The newlyweds had yet to establish their reputations, and every gesture, every glance, every hesitation was fodder for suspicion. Among nobles, the stakes were even higher. An alliance between two families could crumble if accusations of infidelity or impotence surfaced. Chronicles are filled with tales of annulments granted on the basis of unconsummated marriages, with brides sent back to their families in disgrace and grooms scrambling to explain their failures. One French noblewoman in the 12th century successfully argued for annulment by proving her husband's impotence in front of a court humiliation so profound that it became legend. The point was clear. The bedroom was never just the bedroom. It was a courtroom, a stage, a battlefield. And what of pleasure? Did anyone in these honeymoons actually enjoy themselves? The answer is complicated. The medieval church taught that sex was primarily for procreation, not enjoyment. Pleasure was often treated as sinful, especially for women. A wife was expected to submit to her husband's advances without complaint, and her enjoyment, or lack thereof, was irrelevant. Yet we know from poetry, from bawdy tales whispered in taverns, that people sought and sometimes found pleasure despite the rules. Courtly love literature, with its knights sighing over unattainable ladies, reflects a longing for something beyond duty, for passion, for desire. But in marriage, especially in the early days, such passion was rare. So if we strip away the romance, what we're left with is a honeymoon that was less a vacation and more an initiation. It was a test of endurance, a public contract sealed under the scrutiny of family, church, and society. It was a time when new wives learned their place, when new husbands asserted theirs, and when scandal hovered like a shadow at the edge of the marriage bed. To modernize, it looks less like the beginning of a love story and more like the first act of a trial, with the rest of life stretching out as the sentence. And yet, the very awkwardness, the very scandal of these honeymoons makes them fascinating. They remind us that the private lives of the past were never truly private. They were bound up in ritual, law, and public expectation. To survive a medieval honeymoon was to survive the crushing weight of a system that valued alliances over affection, heirs over happiness, appearances over intimacy. In the next part, we'll look closer at the role of the church and how religion shaped not just the wedding ceremony, but the bedchamber itself. Because in the Middle Ages, even God seemed to have an opinion about what happened under the covers. The The wedding feast has ended, the marriage bed has been tested, and the couple has survived their first nights under the watchful gaze of family and servants. But even as they adjust to the realities of married life, there is another presence that hovers above the bedchamber, silent but inescapable: the church. In medieval Europe, religion was not merely a Sunday affair. It was the air people breathed, the calendar they lived by, and the set of invisible chains that bound every thought and action. And so, it should come as no surprise that the church had much to say about honeymoons, about consummation, and about what was and was not allowed beneath the sheets. To begin with, the church viewed marriage as a sacrament, a holy union designed not for pleasure, but for procreation. The act of sex itself was seen as necessary, but dangerous, a kind of spiritual tightrope walk. Done correctly, within marriage, it was holy. Done for pleasure, too often, or in unusual ways, it veered into sin. Imagine newlyweds, nervous enough as it was, also burdened with the knowledge that God Himself was supposedly peering over their shoulders, frowning disapprovingly if they lingered too long in their enjoyment. That was the atmosphere of a medieval honeymoon. Not just awkward, but morally fraught. Priests and theologians produced entire manuals on the subject, eager to guide the faithful in their most intimate moments. Lists of forbidden days filled these texts. Newlyweds were warned against relations on Sundays, holy days, feast days, fast days, Lent, Advent, and Fridays. If you're keeping count, that eliminated nearly half the year, sometimes more. Add to that the restrictions during pregnancy, menstruation, or the 40 days after childbirth, and one begins to wonder when married couples were actually permitted to be together at all. The irony, of course, is that the church demanded procreation, but limited opportunities for it to such an extent that scandal seemed inevitable. The rules did not end with the calendar. The church also dictated how couples were to behave in bed. Only the missionary position was sanctioned. Anything else was labeled unnatural, even sinful. Kissing, caressing, or lingering in acts of intimacy were suspect. Passion was not to be encouraged. In fact, too much enjoyment was believed to endanger the soul. And yet, despite these prohibitions, priests confessed that enforcement was nearly impossible. The very existence of so many rules suggests that people broke them often. It is hard to imagine young newlyweds, finally alone after days of scrutiny, carefully consulting a mental list of holy days before daring to touch each other. Still, the influence of these teachings seeped deep into medieval culture. Guilt and fear clung to the bedchamber like smoke in a thatched roof. A husband who desired his wife too much risked being labeled lustful, one of the deadly sins. A wife who resisted could be accused of failing in her duty. Confessionals filled with the whispered anxieties of couples who weren't sure if what they had done was sinful. Was it wrong to enjoy it? Was it wrong to want more? And priests, many of whom had little to no experience with married life, were expected to guide them with certainty. The church also involved itself in verifying consummation. As bizarre as it sounds, ecclesiastical courts sometimes ruled on whether a marriage was valid based on testimony about the wedding night. Witnesses might be called, sheets examined, and physicians consulted. One infamous case in France involved a husband accused of impotence. To prove his virility, he was ordered to perform in front of medical experts, a humiliation that made its way into chronicles. These cases remind us that the honeymoon was not simply private, it was a matter of public record, a legal and religious necessity. And then there were the darker intersections of faith and sexuality. Some clergy warned that demons might exploit moments of passion, slipping into the bedchamber to tempt or corrupt the couple. Others claimed that excessive desire invited illness, weakness, or even possession. These ideas were not mere superstition. They were preached from pulpits and recorded in theological tracts. Imagine lying beside your new spouse, already exhausted from the endless rules, and now wondering if the shadow in the corner was your imagination or a demon come to watch. For peasants, the church's rules were less strictly followed, but the influence was still felt. Parish priests might scold couples for being too affectionate in public or for bearing children too close together, as if the timing of conception were anything but unpredictable. And even among the illiterate, the fear of sin lingered. A bad harvest, a sick child, a sudden death, any misfortune could be linked in their minds to some misstep in the bedroom. Guilt was a powerful currency, and the church collected it faithfully. Yet even within this suffocating framework, people found ways to bend the rules. Love poems circulated quietly, filled with imagery that would make a priest blush. Folk tales told of clever wives outsmarting lecherous priests, or of couples finding joy in spite of restrictions. The very existence of these stories shows that people longed for tenderness, for passion, for something beyond the rigid boundaries laid down by theology. Honeymoons may have been watched, judged, and regulated, but they were also moments when human desire proved stubbornly alive. In truth, the scandal of medieval honeymoons lay not only in their lack of privacy, but in the sheer tension between duty and desire. The church demanded that sex be both frequent enough to produce heirs and restrained enough to avoid sin. Families demanded heirs immediately, yet the rules restricted when and how they could be conceived. Couples were left stranded in the middle, trying to navigate an impossible maze of expectations. Every night could feel like a test, not just of affection, but of morality, of fertility, of loyalty to God and family alike. When we imagine honeymoons today, we think of love, intimacy, and freedom. When medieval people thought of honeymoons, they thought of responsibility, suspicion, and judgment. And yet, beneath the weight of it all, there must have been couples who found moments of laughter, of tenderness, of genuine connection. Even under the eye of the church, even within the strictures of law, human beings remained stubbornly human. They whispered, they touched, they loved. And in those small rebellions, they carved out a sliver of privacy in a world that refused to allow it. So the medieval honeymoon, far from being a holiday, was a battlefield, not of swords and banners, but of desire and doctrine, of families and priests, of hope and humiliation. To enter marriage was to step onto this battlefield, to fight for scraps of affection amid the rules and rituals. In the next part, we'll move deeper into that struggle, looking at how fertility, childbirth, and scandal shaped not just the early days of marriage, but its entire foundation. Because if the wedding night was awkward, what followed was often far more terrifying. The honeymoon, if it could be called that, did not end with the first nights of intimacy. What followed was often a test of endurance, a waiting game in which the bride's body became the stage for expectations, fears, and scandal. Fertility was the cornerstone of marriage. For noble families, it was about dynasties and land. For peasants, it was about survival. More hands for the fields, more children to care for aging parents. And so, after the sheets had been displayed, after the guests had left, everyone began to watch for the first signs of pregnancy. The bride's body was no longer her own. It was property, inspected for swelling bellies, scrutinized for missed cycles, whispered about in kitchens and great halls alike. For many women, the pressure began almost immediately. A missed period was taken as proof of consummation, even if it was only stress or illness. If months passed with no sign of a child, rumors began to spread. Was the husband impotent? Was the wife barren? Was God punishing the family for some hidden sin? These whispers could turn poisonous, undermining reputations, sowing discord between families, and sometimes leading to annulments or worse. The honeymoon, instead of being a time of closeness, could feel like a countdown clock ticking toward judgment. The obsession with fertility was not limited to noble courts. In small villages, gossip could be just as cruel. A woman who did not conceive within a year was pitied, then mocked, then suspected of secret sins. A man whose wife did not quicken was accused of weakness, even witchcraft. It was a world with little medical knowledge and even less compassion. Superstition filled the void. Amulets were worn, herbs consumed, prayers whispered to saints whose relics were said to help barren couples. Some couples visited holy wells or made pilgrimages, desperate for divine intervention. Others turned to folk remedies so bizarre they seem almost like satire. Eating roasted hare testicles, rubbing honey and fish bones on the stomach, or lying with a charm carved from ash wood beneath the pillow. None of it mattered much. But hope is a stubborn thing. And then, when a woman finally did become pregnant, the real danger began. Pregnancy in the medieval world was not the glowing miracle we might imagine today. It was perilous, unpredictable, and often fatal. The honeymoon, in effect, bled directly into the ordeal of childbirth. Women were expected to carry children often, to risk their lives repeatedly in the service of family and faith. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. For many brides, the honeymoon was the first step toward a lifetime of danger, their bodies bearing the toll of relentless childbearing. Childbirth itself was shrouded in secrecy, attended only by women, midwives, neighbors. Sometimes wise women accused half the time of sorcery. Men were excluded, left to pace outside while the women worked in the smoky heat of the birthing chamber. The experience was brutal, long and uncertain. Pain relief was minimal herbal teas, charms, whispered prayers. If complications arose, there was little anyone could do. A woman could be in labor for days, only to lose both her life and the child's. And yet, the expectation never changed. Survive or not, more pregnancies would follow, more honeymoons would end in swollen bellies, more bodies would be broken in the process of keeping the family line alive. For the Church, childbirth was further proof of the purpose of marriage. Every child was seen as a gift, a sign of God's blessing. But for the women, blessing often looked like suffering. Their honeymoon vows chained them to this cycle, and failure to produce children was seen as a spiritual and social failing. Some women endured repeated miscarriages, stillbirths, or infant deaths, each one adding to their grief and shame. Husbands sometimes abandoned wives who could not bear living children, seeking annulments from the church to marry again. Others stayed, but resentment festered. In noble courts, a barren bride might find herself replaced, sidelined, or even confined to a convent. There were, of course, exceptions. Some couples grew close in the face of tragedy, finding solace in each other's arms despite the losses. But more often, the honeymoon was less a celebration than an initiation into a lifetime of fear, pressure, and grief. For men, the duty was to provide heirs. For women, the duty was to survive long enough to do so, and in a world where survival itself was tenuous, this expectation was both cruel and relentless. The scandals that arose from this cycle could be dramatic. A noble woman suspected of barrenness might be accused of infidelity, blamed for her inability to conceive. Accusations of adultery swirled, sometimes leading to imprisonment or execution. Noble husbands, desperate for heirs, sometimes turned a blind eye to affairs if it meant a child might result, creating tangled webs of suspicion and betrayal. In villages, rumors of witchcraft haunted barren women, and some were driven out or worse, accused of cursing livestock or poisoning wells. Fertility was not just private, it was political, social, even supernatural, and honeymoons were the starting line of that dangerous race. This is why the idea of a honeymoon as we think of it today, intimacy, freedom, discovery, simply did not exist. What existed was a test, a proving ground. Families measured the success of a union not by affection or joy, but by the production of children. The bedchamber was never just a place of rest. It was a factory, an altar, and a courtroom all at once. The newlyweds, no matter how young or terrified, were expected to perform, to produce, to survive. Love was a luxury. Fertility was the mandate. And yet, amid all of this, there must have been quiet moments of rebellion. A husband who comforted his wife during childbirth rather than abandoning her. A wife who whispered her fears in the dark and was met with gentleness instead of impatience. A couple who found laughter in the absurdity of restrictions, or who stole time together when the rules forbade it. These small acts of tenderness may not appear in the chronicles, but they are part of the story, too. For all the talk of scandal and failure, humanity endured. People still longed for warmth, for connection, for something beyond the cold demands of church and family. In the shadow of fertility, scandal never lurked far. Stories circulated of brides who feigned pregnancy, stuffing their gowns with padding to buy themselves time. Others sought secret lovers when their husbands proved impotent, risking exposure, punishment, or worse. There were cases where midwives were bribed to swap stillborn infants for living ones, preserving the illusion of fertility at all costs. The honeymoon might begin with celebration, but it could end in schemes, lies, and betrayals that shaped entire lineages. And so the forbidden medieval honeymoon was not simply about intimacy denied. It was about lives entangled in webs of expectation, women crushed beneath the weight of fertility, men desperate for heirs, families willing to risk scandal for survival. It was a game in which the stakes were high, and the players often unwilling, trapped by the rules of their world. And as the honeymoon turned into years of duty, the shadows of scandal only deepened, weaving themselves into the very fabric of medieval marriage. By now, the honeymoon had lost whatever charm it might have held. The young couple was no longer merely navigating awkward glances and whispered rules. They were entangled in the messy web of money, power, and family politics. Because in medieval Europe, marriage was rarely a matter of love. It was a contract, a negotiation, sometimes even a battlefield, with the bride and groom as pawns in a larger game. If the bed was a proving ground for fertility, it was also a ledger for wealth and alliances. The honeymoon, then, became another stage where fortunes could rise or fall. Dowries were at the heart of this system. A bride did not come to marriage empty-handed. She brought with her land, money, livestock, or promises of political alliances. The dowry was not a gift, it was an investment, a transaction meant to cement ties between families. Once the marriage was consummated, the dowry was locked in. If the marriage failed before consummation, the dowry might return to the bride's family, sparking disputes and sometimes even violence. Thus, the honeymoon night was not simply about intimacy. It was a financial deadline, a moment that could determine the fate of fortunes. For the bride, the dowry was a symbol of her worth in her family's eyes. Too small a dowry, and she was considered a burden, a poor bargain. Too large, and she was resented, the pressure to live up to the investment crushing her. Brides sometimes carried chests filled with linens, jewelry, or coin to their new homes, a public display of the wealth exchanged. Guests at weddings would murmur about the size of the dowry, comparing it to others, turning the honeymoon into a kind of public auction of status. The young couple, perhaps still trembling from their first encounter, now found themselves burdened with the weight of an economic alliance far bigger than their own lives. And where there is money, there is always scandal. Dowry disputes could drag on for years. If a bride died in childbirth before bearing heirs, families fought over whether the dowry should remain with the husband or return to her kin. If the husband squandered the dowry, he was branded irresponsible, shaming his household. If the wife's family claimed the marriage was never properly consummated, they might attempt to recall the dowry, sparking humiliating public inquiries into the couple's private life. The honeymoon thus became entangled with lawyers, priests, and courts, stripping away any illusion of intimacy. This financial dimension was especially fraught among nobles. A nobleman who married a wealthy heiress could double his land holdings overnight. A poorly negotiated marriage could ruin a family's fortunes. Brides were pawns in dynastic chess games, their wombs tied to estates, their honeymoons watched as if they were coronations. The consummation was not just about a family name, but about borders, castles, and taxes. Chroniclers record disputes that erupted when a nobleman claimed his marriage was valid, but his wife's family insisted it was not. Behind the arguments lay land worth fighting wars over, and the honeymoon bed was the battlefield on which those wars were decided. Even among peasants, where dowries were smaller, the principle held. A cow, a pig, a plot of land. These were no less important to survival than castles were to nobles. A peasant bride who failed to produce heirs quickly might see her husband's family regret the bargain. Jokes and gossip about wasted dowries flew around village alehouses, mocking both husband and wife. The honeymoon, far from being a time of tenderness, became a reminder that marriage was not simply about two people, but about families, wealth, and survival. Adding to the tension were dower rights, the portion of a husband's estate promised to his wife should he die. The honeymoon was the beginning of her claim, and disputes over whether a marriage had been properly sealed could decide whether she lived comfortably as a widow or was cast out with nothing. Widows were vulnerable figures in medieval society, often treated with suspicion if they remarried, sometimes accused of hastening their husbands' deaths. The honeymoon, therefore, cast a shadow far beyond its first nights. It set the stage for a woman's future security or her future ruin. Money also introduced temptations that turned into scandal. Some husbands married wealthy brides, only to abandon them once the dowry was secured, taking mistresses openly while the wives languished. Others treated their new wives harshly, squandering their fortunes and leaving them destitute. Stories circulated of brides who sought comfort in secret lovers after realizing their marriages were little more than financial traps. These scandals filled the gossip mills of both villages and courts, whispered with equal relish by peasants and nobles alike. The honeymoon, rather than a time of love, was often the opening act of betrayal. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to dismiss these marriages as cold and transactional. Yet imagine the young couple, bound together by contracts they never negotiated, struggling to find some sense of connection under the crushing weight of expectation. Some may have resigned themselves to duty, but others surely found ways to carve out companionship, even love, within the cage of financial obligation. Perhaps they laughed together at the absurdity of rules, or comforted each other when dowry disputes turned ugly. Humanity persisted even in the shadow of money, though it rarely found its way into official records. The scandals of wealth were often recorded because they affected powerful families. Chronicles brim with tales of marriages annulled over dowries, heirs disinherited because of contested consummations, estates divided and ruined by disputes over money bound to honeymoons. One noble woman was accused of faking her virginity, not because anyone particularly cared about her virtue, but because her dowry was enormous and her husband's family wanted it back. In cases like this, the personal became political, and the honeymoon became a stage for lawsuits, accusations, and humiliation that could echo for decades. In this light, the forbidden medieval honeymoon was not only about intimacy denied, but about power wielded. It was a transaction cloaked in ritual, a scandal waiting to happen. Every gift, every sheet, every whispered rumor carried financial consequences, and at the center of it all were two people, often too young, too frightened, too powerless to control their fates. When we think of honeymoons now, we imagine distant beaches, candlelit dinners, the luxury of escape. For the medieval couple, the only escape was death, annulment, or the slim hope that affection might grow in spite of the chains of money and duty. And so the honeymoon became another form of bondage, a reminder that even in the most intimate spaces, power and wealth intruded, shaping lives, breeding scandals, and reminding everyone that marriage was not love, it was survival. If the honeymoon was awkward and suffocating in a peasant's thatched hut, it was magnified 100-fold in the glittering, dangerous halls of the nobility. For here, marriage was never just about two individuals or even two families. It was a political act, a union of bloodlines that could alter the fate of kingdoms. And the honeymoon, far from being private, was often staged as public theater, a spectacle in which courtiers, rivals, and foreign ambassadors all looked on, hungry for scandal. Royal and noble weddings were events of state. Alliances were sealed, treaties signed, and armies secured with the exchange of vows. Yet everyone knew that none of it mattered unless the marriage was consummated. A treaty written in ink was one thing, but a treaty written in blood and air was what truly mattered. Thus, the honeymoon became the stage on which dynasties rose or fell. No matter how splendid the feast, no matter how grand the ceremony, if the bride did not conceive, The marriage was considered fragile, even void. In such a climate, privacy was impossible. At courts across Europe, elaborate rituals surrounded the bridal chamber. In France, England, Spain, and the German states, it was common for the bride and groom to be escorted to bed in a noisy procession of courtiers, musicians, and priests. The couple, exhausted from days of ceremony, would be undressed by attendants, blessed by bishops, and then tucked into bed under the watchful eyes of half the court. Sometimes, nobles lingered in the room, joking, singing bawdy songs, or even throwing nuts and fruit onto the bed as a supposed charm for fertility. Only after this humiliating display did the couple find themselves alone or alone enough. For even then, guards and servants remained nearby, ears pressed to doors, waiting for sounds that would confirm their duty had been fulfilled. In some cases, the pressure to prove consummation became grotesque. Chronicles tell of sheets displayed to courtiers or midwives examining the bride afterward. In Spain, one princess's virginity was confirmed by medical inspection before her marriage, a ritual that humiliated her but satisfied the political needs of her father's court. In France, noble brides were sometimes scrutinized as if their bodies were legal documents. Their ability to bleed, to conceive, to bear heirs was not simply personnalité, was national policy. One can only imagine the terror of a young woman, perhaps only 14 or 15, thrust into this ritual, her body treated as evidence in a trial she had not chosen. Men, too, were not spared humiliation. Kings and princes accused of impotence found themselves at the center of scandal. In one infamous French case, the king's ability to perform was questioned so persistently that doctors and clerics forced him to prove himself in degrading public trials. Every failure became fuel for rumors, and every rumor threatened the stability of the crown. For such men, the honeymoon was less about pleasure and more about survival. To fail in bed was to fail as a ruler. These scandals did not stay confined to whispers at court. They spread like wildfire across kingdoms, carried by ambassadors eager to report weakness and by poets eager to mock. Pamphlets, poems, and gossip chronicled the supposed failures of royal beds, and the reputations of entire dynasties could be tarnished by accusations that a marriage was unconsummated. In an age where heirs were everything, the bedroom became the battlefield of power. The honeymoon was not simply a private union. It was a diplomatic crisis waiting to happen. For noble women, the stakes were especially high. A bride accused of barrenness might be divorced, disgraced, or sent back to her family in shame. Worse still, she might remain married but be sidelined while her husband openly took mistresses, fathering bastards who sometimes threatened to usurp legitimate heirs. Queens and noble women walked a razor's edge, their every movement scrutinized for signs of fertility. A missed period, a pale face, a swollen belly all became fodder for speculation, and speculation could quickly become scandal. Even when pregnancies did occur, danger lurked. The death of a royal bride in childbirth was more than a personal tragedy. It could unravel alliances, weaken dynasties, and spark wars. Foreign powers watched closely, waiting for an opportunity to exploit weakness. The honeymoon, in this sense, never ended. It stretched into months and years of relentless expectation, each pregnancy a test, each failure a scandal. Some couples found ways to resist the pressure, at least in small ways. A few kings were famously affectionate with their queens, defying courtiers who urged them to seek heirs elsewhere. Some noble women wielded their sexuality as power, leveraging their influence in the bedchamber to secure political advantage. But more often, the bed was a place of fear. For every tender gesture recorded in chronicles, there are far more stories of neglect, humiliation, and betrayal. The honeymoon was the spark, but the fire consumed lives long afterward. What makes this all the more striking is the sheer performative nature of it. Medieval courts turned the most intimate moment of human life into a stage play, complete with an audience, props, and judges. The couple at the center might have felt less like lovers and more like actors in a scandalous drama, their every move scrutinized and recorded. And just like any performance, there were critics eager to declare failure. No wonder, then, that so many noble marriages became breeding grounds not only for heirs, but for rumors, resentments, and open scandals that shaped history. The forbidden medieval honeymoon, when seen in this light, reveals a darker truth. Intimacy was not private, desire was not free, and love was rarely the point. Instead, the honeymoon was a contract signed in flesh, a performance staged for power, and a scandal waiting to happen. Behind the silks and candles, behind the processions and blessings, there were two frightened people trapped in a system that demanded everything and forgave nothing. And as history shows again and again, when intimacy is politicized, scandal is never far behind. If the honeymoon was awkward and suffocating in a peasant's thatched hut, it was magnified 100-fold in the glittering, dangerous halls of the nobility. For here, marriage was never just about two individuals or even two families. It was a political act, a union of bloodlines that could alter the fate of kingdoms. And the honeymoon, far from being private, was often staged as public theater, a spectacle in which courtiers, rivals, and foreign ambassadors all looked on, hungry for scandal. Royal and noble weddings were events of state. Alliances were sealed, treaties signed, and armies secured with the exchange of vows. Yet everyone knew that none of it mattered unless the marriage was consummated. A treaty written in ink was one thing, but a treaty written in blood and air was what truly mattered. Thus the honeymoon became the stage on which dynasties rose or fell. No matter how splendid the feast, no matter how grand the ceremony, if the bride did not conceive, the marriage was considered fragile, even void. In such a climate, privacy was impossible. At courts across Europe, elaborate rituals surrounded the bridal chamber. In France, England, Spain, and the German states, it was common for the bride and groom to be escorted to bed in a noisy procession of courtiers, musicians, and priests. The couple, exhausted from days of ceremony, would be undressed by attendants, blessed by bishops, and then tucked into bed under the watchful eyes of half the court. Sometimes, nobles lingered in the room, joking, singing bawdy songs, or even throwing nuts and fruit onto the bed as a supposed charm for fertility. Only after this humiliating display did the couple find themselves alone or alone enough. For even then, guards and servants remained nearby, ears pressed to doors, waiting for sounds that would confirm their duty had been fulfilled. In some cases, the pressure to prove consummation became grotesque. Chronicles tell of sheets displayed to courtiers, or midwives examining the bride afterward. In Spain, one princess's virginity was confirmed by medical inspection before her marriage, a ritual that humiliated her but satisfied the political needs of her father's court. In France, noble brides were sometimes scrutinized as if their bodies were legal documents. Their ability to bleed, to conceive, to bear heirs was not simply personal, it was national policy. One can only imagine the terror of a young woman, perhaps only 14 or 15, thrust into this ritual, her body treated as evidence in a trial she had not chosen. Men, too, were not spared humiliation. Kings and princes accused of impotence found themselves at the center of scandal. In one infamous French case, the king's ability to perform was questioned so persistently that doctors and clerics forced him to prove himself in degrading public trials. Every failure became fuel for rumors, and every rumor threatened the stability of the crown. For such men, the honeymoon was less about pleasure and more about survival. To fail in bed was to fail as a ruler. These scandals did not stay confined to whispers at court. They spread like wildfire across kingdoms, carried by ambassadors eager to report weakness and by poets eager to mock. Pamphlets, poems, and gossip chronicled the supposed failures of royal beds, and the reputations of entire dynasties could be tarnished by accusations that a marriage was unconsummated. In an age where heirs were everything, the bedroom became the battlefield of power. The honeymoon was not simply a private union, it was a diplomatic crisis waiting to happen. For noble women, the stakes were especially high. A bride accused of barrenness might be divorced, disgraced, or sent back to her family in shame. Worse still, she might remain married but be sidelined while her husband openly took mistresses, fathering bastards who sometimes threatened to usurp legitimate heirs. Queens and noble women walked a razor's edge, their every movement scrutinized for signs of fertility. A missed period, a pale face, a swollen belly all became fodder for speculation. And speculation could quickly become scandal. Even when pregnancies did occur, danger lurked. The death of a royal bride in childbirth was more than a personal tragedy. It could unravel alliances, weaken dynasties, and spark wars. Foreign powers watched closely, waiting for an opportunity to exploit weakness. The honeymoon, in this sense, never ended. It stretched into months and years of relentless expectation, each pregnancy a test, each failure a scandal. Some couples found ways to resist the pressure, at least in small ways. A few kings were famously affectionate with their queens, defying courtiers who urged them to seek heirs elsewhere. Some noble women wielded their sexuality as power, leveraging their influence in the bedchamber to secure political advantage. But more often, the bed was a place of fear. For every tender gesture recorded in chronicles, there are far more stories of neglect, humiliation, and betrayal. The honeymoon was the spark, but the fire consumed lives long afterward. What makes this all the more striking is the sheer performative nature of it. Medieval courts turned the most intimate moment of human life into a stage play, complete with an audience, props, and judges. The couple at the center might have felt less like lovers and more like actors in a scandalous drama, their every move scrutinized and recorded. And just like any performance, there were critics eager to declare failure. No wonder, then, that so many noble marriages became breeding grounds not only for heirs, but for rumors, resentments, and open scandals that shaped history. The forbidden medieval honeymoon, when seen in this light, reveals a darker truth. Intimacy was not private, desire was not free, and love was rarely the point. Instead, the honeymoon was a contract signed in flesh, a performance staged for power, and a scandal waiting to happen. Behind the silks and candles, behind the processions and blessings, there were two frightened people trapped in a system that demanded everything and forgave nothing. And as history shows again and again, when intimacy is politicized, scandal is never far behind. The honeymoon may have been a proving ground, but it was never the whole story. Once the ceremonies were over, the sheets inspected, and the whispers quieted down, the true test began. Living together. And in that prolonged aftermath, another force crept in, a force that filled the halls of castles and the cottages of peasants alike jealousy. If the honeymoon was about duty and scrutiny, the months that followed were about temptation, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of expectations. For young brides, the reality of marriage could be bitter. Many were paired with men far older, chosen not for their affection, but for their land or influence. After the brief spectacle of the wedding and the humiliations of the bridal chamber, they found themselves bound to husbands who were strangers at best, tyrants at worst. Some grooms were harsh, demanding, or indifferent. Others took mistresses openly, leaving their new wives humiliated before family and court. For a bride who entered marriage with dreams, if she allowed herself any, the disillusionment must have been devastating. And yet, in such oppressive circumstances, desire did not disappear. If anything, it grew more dangerous. The medieval world was filled with temptations. Courts were hotbeds of intrigue, where handsome squires, ambitious courtiers, and exotic ambassadors filled the halls. Even in villages, the closeness of daily life meant that couples could not help but notice others, especially when their marriages were arranged rather than chosen. The forbidden nature of such attractions made them all the more intoxicating. Infidelity was a scandal with consequences as varied as they were severe. For men, dalliances were often tolerated, even expected. Kings kept mistresses, noblemen pursued affairs, and peasants slipped away to barns and fields. Society may have frowned, but punishment was rare. A man's infidelity was seen as weakness, not crime. For women, however, the rules were cruelly different. A wife suspected of adultery faced ruin. At best, she might be cast aside, sent back to her family in disgrace. At worst, she could face trial, torture, even execution. The double standard was brutal, but it was also deeply entrenched. This inequality turned jealousy into a constant shadow over medieval marriages. Husbands watched their wives for signs of betrayal, sometimes locking them in guarded chambers or surrounding them with servants. Chronicles are filled with stories of noble women imprisoned for suspected affairs, some guilty, others innocent. Even the faintest rumor could ignite suspicion, and suspicion was often enough to destroy lives. The honeymoon's scrutiny did not fade, it simply shifted, becoming a lifelong surveillance of fidelity. In noble courts, scandals of infidelity could destabilize entire kingdoms. A queen accused of adultery was not merely a wife in disgrace. She was a political actor, her supposed betrayal threatening the legitimacy of heirs and the stability of alliances. One need only recall the fate of Anne Boleyn centuries later to see how accusations of infidelity could lead to a queen's death. Though her story belongs to a later era, it echoed older patterns already well established. The honeymoon may have launched the marriage, but suspicion and jealousy dictated its survival. Among peasants, infidelity sparked gossip and feuds that could ripple through small communities. A wife caught with a neighbor might see her family shamed, her children mocked, her husband's honor tainted. Violence sometimes followed, A cuckolded husband might take vengeance on his rival, and blood spilled over affairs was not uncommon. In villages where everyone knew everyone else's business, infidelity was rarely secret for long. The scandal was often worse than the act itself, and yet, despite the risks, affairs happened. Human desire is rarely subdued by law or custom. Some women took lovers secretly, aided by servants or sympathetic friends. Folk tales and literature brim with stories of illicit passion knights risking all for forbidden love, ladies sneaking away to meet their paramours, peasants finding brief escapes from harsh marriages. The very fact that these stories were told and retold suggests that such scandals were both feared and admired. They revealed the cracks in the rigid system, the places where love and lust slipped through. For those caught in suspicion, honeymoons became retroactively tainted. A wife accused of infidelity might find her wedding night re-examined, her virginity questioned, her consummation cast into doubt. A husband accused of impotence might see his wife's pregnancy raised as evidence of betrayal. The honeymoon, far from being a sealed memory, became evidence in the courtroom of life, dragged out again and again as proof or condemnation. The bed, once a site of awkward consummation, became a crime scene in the theater of jealousy. Some marriages survived jealousy, not because love triumphed, but because appearances were maintained. A nobleman might turn a blind eye to his wife's discreet affairs, so long as her lovers posed no political threat. A peasant husband might tolerate whispers if his wife still bore him children. But beneath the surface, resentment brewed, scandals simmered, and lives were quietly poisoned by suspicion. For every story of passionate rebellion, there were countless stories of silent endurance, of couples bound together in mistrust, their honeymoons a distant memory of enforced intimacy. It is in this atmosphere that the true scandal of medieval honeymoons emerges. They were not beginnings of freedom, but beginnings of captivity. They launched marriages into lifetimes of surveillance, where desire was policed, jealousy was weaponized, and infidelity was both inevitable and forbidden. The honeymoon, far from being a celebration, was the start of a long trial, one in which failure could mean disgrace, exile, or death. And yet again, humanity persisted. Some couples did find affection, even love. Some laughed at the rules, comforted each other through suspicion, and carved out private bonds in the midst of scrutiny. Others turned their scandals into power, wielding their affairs as weapons in the dangerous games of court. For better or worse, the honeymoon was never the end of the story. It was merely the prologue to a drama that could last a lifetime. The medieval honeymoon, if it ever truly ended, was lived not in private, but under the eyes of many others, and none watched more closely than those who worked in the shadows of households. The servants. In castles and manor houses, in merchant homes and peasant cottages, the presence of attendants and helpers meant that intimacy was never entirely sealed away. These were the people who tended the fire, fetched the water, scrubbed the linens, and carried messages. They were the unseen witnesses of married life, and in a world where rumors were as powerful as armies, their knowledge could make or break reputations. From the first night itself, servants played a role. It was often maids who undressed the bride, carrying her heavy gown away and leaving her shivering in her chemise. Grooms were likewise assisted, stripped of their ceremonial garb and deposited in bed like actors after a play. The attendants might linger, lighting candles or tucking covers around the couple while exchanging knowing looks. Once the curtains were drawn, they slipped out, but never far enough to miss the sounds or silences that followed. In noble households, some were even ordered to remain nearby, listening at doors or stationed in adjoining chambers. What they saw, what they heard, quickly became the currency of gossip. Servants were the first to notice signs of strain. A bride who wept through the night, a groom who stumbled to bed drunk, a silence that stretched on too long. These details were recorded not in chronicles, but in whispers, passed from maid to chamberlain to rival courtier. In villages, where homes were small, neighbors filled this role, but the principle was the same. Privacy was an illusion. Life was lived in shared spaces, and secrets were fragile things. In many cases, servants became active players in the drama. A trusted maid might smuggle letters between a lady and her secret lover. A loyal groom might cover for his master's indiscretions, swearing that the lord had spent the night where he had not. Bribes changed hands, loyalty shifted, and suddenly the household itself became a web of intrigue. One careless word from a servant could doom a bride accused of infidelity or expose a groom who failed to perform his duty. In courts, where scandal was a weapon, servants were often both the spies and the scapegoats. Some households went further, using servants as spies deliberately. A suspicious husband might order his wife's maid to report on her mistress's behavior. A wary father-in-law might pay a servant to keep watch over the couple, ensuring the bride did not disgrace the family name. Even the church employed such tactics, with confessors urging maids and attendants to reveal what they had witnessed. The honeymoon thus became a stage not only for the couple, but for an entire supporting cast of watchers, each with their own loyalties, fears, and ambitions. The potential for scandal was enormous. A careless servant might gossip in the marketplace, and by evening the entire town knew that the bride had not bled on her sheets. A disgruntled maid dismissed without wages might invent a story of infidelity, spreading it to anyone who would listen. Some servants blackmailed their masters, threatening to expose secrets unless they were paid. In such a system, trust was perilous. A bride could confide in her maid, but that maid's silence was never guaranteed. And yet, servants were not merely enemies of privacy. For many brides, they were the only source of comfort. A frightened girl, thrust into marriage at 14, might find more kindness in the hands of her maid than in the arms of her husband. Maids offered advice, shared remedies, whispered reassurances. They knew the dangers of childbirth, the tricks to soothe pain, the secrets of herbs that might delay or end a pregnancy. In these hidden exchanges, women carved out small spaces of agency in a world that denied them control. The honeymoon might be a trap, but with the help of trusted attendants, some found ways to navigate it. Literature of the time reflects this dual role. Courtly romances often depict maids aiding lovers, slipping them into chambers or covering their tracks. At the same time, moral tales warn of treacherous servants who betray their masters for coin. Reality, as always, lay somewhere between. Servants lived precarious lives, bound by duty but tempted by opportunity. They knew more than anyone about the lives of their masters, and knowledge was power, even if it rarely shielded them from poverty. Among peasants, the line between family and servant blurred, but the effect was similar. Neighbors shared walls, children roamed in and out of homes, and nothing was secret for long. A honeymoon in a single-room hut was hardly private when in-laws snored in the same space or livestock shuffled nearby. Here, scandal spread not through servants but through gossiping neighbors, quick to remark on who left whose bed at dawn or which bride's belly grew too quickly after her wedding night. In every class, from castle to cottage, the theme remained the same. Intimacy was never entirely one's own. The presence of servants and spies gave the honeymoon a haunting quality. Even in moments when the couple might have found genuine tenderness, they could never be certain that eyes and ears were not nearby. Every word risked repetition, every silence risked interpretation, and so suspicion thrived. Families used servants as informants, courts used them as pawns, and the lives of newlyweds unfolded in a haze of surveillance. This constant intrusion only deepened the sense that medieval honeymoons were not about love or discovery, but about performance and control. Couples were actors on a stage, their audience composed not only of priests and parents, but of servants sweeping the floors and filling the basins. And like any audience, those servants judged, gossiped, and occasionally betrayed. The honeymoon bed, supposedly sacred, was in truth crowded with invisible witnesses, their whispers carrying far beyond the chamber walls. For the newlyweds, the result was a mixture of fear and dependence. They feared betrayal, but they also relied on their attendants for survival. Without a maid's help, a noble woman might stumble in her new duties. Without a groom's loyalty, a husband might find his weaknesses exposed. Servants were the hidden architects of the honeymoon, shaping its successes and its scandals in equal measure. And in a world where every scandal mattered, their role was impossible to ignore. In this way, the forbidden medieval honeymoon reveals its strangest truth. It was never just about two people. It was always about the many eyes watching them, the many hands guiding them, the many tongues eager to talk. Love, if it blossomed at all, grew in defiance of this surveillance. Scandal, meanwhile, thrived because of it. And in the great game of medieval marriage, the servants who hovered at the edges often knew more than the players themselves. The medieval world was never free from superstition, and nowhere did those beliefs cling more tightly than to the marriage bed. For all the church's preaching about duty and sacrament, ordinary people, and often nobles, tooled just as heavily on charms, rituals, and whispered magic to guide them through the strange and perilous days after the wedding. The honeymoon, already burdened with pressure and scrutiny, became a stage for superstition to flourish. If the act itself was uncertain, if fertility was a gamble, then surely some charm, some prayer, some hidden talisman might tilt fate in the right direction. Before the wedding night, brides were often prepared with small rituals meant to ensure fertility. Some wore charms stitched into their gowns, tiny tokens sewn discreetly by mothers or midwives. A sprig of rosemary might be tucked into a garter for protection. In some regions, brides carried small amulets carved from bone or wood, thought to drive away infertility and ward off evil spirits. Grooms, too, might receive tokens from family rings inscribed with prayers, belts or girdles believed to increase virility, so relics of saints thought to lend strength. To us, these details sound quaint, but to those who lived in fear of failure, they were lifelines. The bed itself was not exempt. Families sometimes sprinkled the sheets with herbs, fennel for protection, rue to ward off witches, time for courage. In some places, guests threw nuts or seeds onto the bed, a symbolic gesture to encourage fertility. Superstitions about blood mingled with these rituals. The presence of it was celebrated as proof of virginity, but blood also held a dangerous power. Some feared that a jealous neighbor could steal the stained sheets and use them in curses. And so, while the linens might be displayed in triumph, they were often guarded afterward, hidden away like relics of war. Superstition extended to the timing of the honeymoon as well. Certain days were thought to be unlucky, certain moons dangerous. Couples who dared to consummate on unlucky nights risked curses on their children, or so it was believed. Astrologers sometimes advised noble families on the most auspicious time for unions, mapping the stars to predict fertile nights. Even peasants without knowledge of astronomy believed in omens. The cry of an owl near the window, the howling of dogs, or the sudden flickering of candles. Any of these could be read as warnings, and in a world where coincidence often felt like fate, warnings were rarely ignored. The presence of magic was not always protective. Fear of witchcraft loomed over honeymoons as much as it did over childbirth. If a marriage failed to produce children, accusations of sorcery followed quickly. Wives were suspected of casting spells to avoid pregnancy or of having been cursed by rivals. Midwives who offered herbal remedies were praised when they worked and denounced as witches when they failed. A barren couple was never allowed to simply be unlucky. There had to be a hidden cause, and magic was the easiest scapegoat. For those who did believe in charms, the rituals could be elaborate. A bride might drink a potion of honey, herbs, and animal parts before her wedding night, a concoction meant to ensure conception. Some recipes were harmless enough, little more than folk teas. Others were dangerous, mixing toxic plants or strange minerals that caused illness rather than fertility. The desperation to succeed in the honeymoon's test made people reckless, willing to trust anything that offered even a shred of hope. Among nobles, superstition often mingled with politics. A rival court might spread rumors that a queen's womb was cursed, undermining her position before she ever bore a child. Ambassadors carried tales of omens, comets in the sky, strange weather at weddings, birds flying overhead at the wrong moment, each sign twisted into prophecy. A royal honeymoon could thus become more than a private ordeal. It could be interpreted as a cosmic event, its success or failure linked to the destiny of kingdoms. One chronicler claimed that when a French princess failed to conceive, it was because an eclipse darkened the night of her wedding. Proof, he said, that heaven itself disapproved. The church tried, of course, to suppress superstition, branding it as pagan and sinful. Priests condemned the use of charms, the consulting of astrologers, the drinking of potions. Yet even as they preached, they often found themselves surrounded by it. Parishioners confessed to using amulets, but priests hesitated to punish too harshly, knowing that fear drove these practices. Even bishops kept relics in their chambers, bits of bone or cloth from saints thought to have power. The line between sacred relic and pagan charm was thin, and medieval people walked it daily. In truth, the reliance on magic reveals how desperate and frightened people were. The honeymoon was not romantic, it was terrifying. Failure had consequences, disgrace, annulment, ruin. In the face of such pressure, who would not clutch at a charm, whisper a prayer to a saint, or consult the stars? The rituals may seem strange to us, but to them They were acts of survival. Stories of scandal inevitably emerged. A noble bride accused of drinking a potion to avoid her husband. A peasant woman found with a bundle of herbs under her mattress, accused of cursing her fertility. A midwife burned at the stake after too many women in her village miscarried. Each story shows how superstition could turn from protection to danger, how quickly a hopeful charm could become evidence of witchcraft. The honeymoon bed, already burdened with witnesses and expectations, was now haunted by the invisible weight of magic. And yet, in these practices, we also glimpse a kind of humanity. Beneath the rituals and fears was a simple truth. People wanted love, safety, children, a future. They wanted to succeed in their marriages not only for duty, but for themselves. The charms and potions were ways of taking back a little control in a world that gave them almost none. If the church dictated rules, if families demanded heirs, if servants whispered behind doors, then a hidden amulet or a secret potion was a way of pushing back, of saying, "This part, at least, is mine." The forbidden medieval honeymoon was many things: awkward, humiliating, scandalous, but it was also deeply human. Superstition and magic wrapped themselves around the marriage bed because fear lived there, and fear always seeks comfort. Whether in herbs, stars, or whispered prayers, couples reached for something beyond themselves to carry them through. And if sometimes those comforts turned into scandals, it only proved how fragile and exposed they were in those first dangerous days of marriage. When we imagine honeymoons gone wrong, our modern minds conjure images of awkward vacations, misplaced luggage, or a newlywed spat under palm trees. In the Middle Ages, however, the consequences of a honeymoon gone awry were far graver, and sometimes catastrophic. A marriage was not a private contract between two individuals. It was a binding alliance, a spiritual sacrament, and often a political maneuver. When the bed failed, so too did the fragile balance of families, fortunes, and sometimes entire kingdoms. And the most common outcome of these failures was annulment, scandal, or betrayal. Annulments were far more frequent than we might expect. Unlike divorce, which the Church condemned, annulments were a way to declare that a marriage had never been valid in the first place. Grounds for annulment were many: consanguinity, meaning the couple was too closely related; pre-contract, meaning one of them had been betrothed elsewhere; coercion, meaning the bride or groom had not consented. But one of the most significant reasons was non-consummation. If the marriage bed failed, the marriage itself could be declared void. This meant that a honeymoon failure could destroy a union overnight. A bride who remained a virgin might be examined by midwives or physicians to confirm it. A groom suspected of impotence might be subjected to humiliating tests, forced to display his manhood before witnesses or attempt intimacy under scrutiny. Some records describe courts calling for evidence of nocturnal emissions to prove a man's body was capable, an extraordinary invasion of privacy masked as justice. Behind these procedures, however, was often the simple desire of one family to escape an unwanted alliance. The most famous annulment cases belong to kings and queens, where failure to consummate was often more convenient excuse than genuine problem. One striking case was that of Margaret of Scotland and King Eric II of Norway in the late 13th century. Though married in a grand ceremony, their union quickly soured, and rumors spread that Eric had been unable to perform his duties as husband. The whispers undermined his authority, fueling political instability in a fragile kingdom. Whether or not the failure was real hardly mattered. The perception was enough to weaken him. Other annulments were less lofty but just as scandalous. Records from ecclesiastical courts are full of bitter testimonies, with brides and grooms accusing one another of deceit, cruelty, or magical interference. Some brides claimed their husbands had been bewitched into impotence. Some husbands accused wives of hiding prior liaisons. Each case reveals how fragile a marriage could be when the honeymoon faltered, and how quickly private struggles turned into public theatre. But annulments were not the only outcome. Betrayal often followed failure. A groom who found no satisfaction with his bride might turn elsewhere, seeking lovers among courtiers or serving women. A bride disappointed or neglected might likewise pursue secret affairs. Though dangerous, these betrayals were not uncommon. Courtly romances idealized illicit love, spinning tales of ladies and knights who found passion outside marriage. For many trapped in cold, arranged unions, betrayal was less a sin than a survival strategy. These betrayals, however, carried explosive risks. Discovery could lead to public humiliation, imprisonment, or even death. Noble women accused of adultery faced particular peril. Their bodies were seen as vessels for dynastic continuity, and any child born under suspicion threatened entire lineages. Men were not immune either. Knights caught in affairs with married ladies could lose land, titles, or their lives. Yet despite the risks, affairs flourished in the shadow of failed honeymoons. The inability of one bed to ignite often led to the lighting of another, scandal smoldering behind castle walls. One of the more notorious betrayals followed the ill-fated marriage of Anne of Brittany to Maximilian of Austria in 1490. Though technically married by proxy, the union was never consummated, and the arrangement quickly collapsed under French pressure. Anne, instead of remaining Maximilian's bride, was married off to King Charles VIII of France. The scandal was not only about politics. Whispers of betrayal and abandonment clung to her reputation. The failure of consummation provided the loophole, but it also left a shadow of disgrace. Her subsequent marriages were haunted by the need to prove herself fruitful and loyal, a burden born of that first annulled union. Not all betrayals were sexual. Some were political, subtle acts of disobedience that stemmed from broken marital trust. A bride might secretly maintain correspondence with her natal family, undermining her husband's household. A husband might divert his wife's dowry to other purposes, betraying the economic foundation of the marriage. These betrayals did not make for romantic ballads, but they were just as ruinous, eroding the fragile fabric of alliances. And they often began in the wake of honeymoons that had failed to create intimacy or unity. In villages, scandal over failed honeymoons spread like wildfire. A man accused of impotence might be mocked in songs sung at taverns, his virility questioned every time he lifted a mug of ale. A woman suspected of avoiding her husband might be jeered at in the marketplace, her chastity doubted in whispers. Community life offered no refuge. Instead, it magnified every misstep. Betrayal in such contexts was not only personal, but communal, with neighbors taking sides, family feuding, and reputations collapsing. Perhaps most tragic were the betrayals born of sheer desperation. Couples unable to conceive often faced relentless pressure from both family and community. Wives were accused of barrenness, husbands of weakness, yet neither could afford the shame. In desperation, some sought secret remedies, potions from herbalists, prayers at shrines, or illicit liaisons meant to test fertility. If a child appeared, it might be quietly accepted as legitimate, the betrayal ignored in favor of preserving appearances. But if the deception was uncovered, scandal erupted, tearing households apart. Behind all these cases lies a grim irony. The honeymoon, intended as the joyous beginning of marriage, was also its most dangerous moment. Failure in those first days created cracks that widened into annulments, betrayals, and scandals. What should have been a private exploration became a public trial, and one with stakes that few could withstand. For us, these stories read like tragedies, heavy with injustice and humiliation. But for medieval couples, they were simply reality. Marriage was never just about love. It was about survival, duty, and alliance. A failed honeymoon was not merely a personal disappointment, it was a destabilizing event, a breach in the fragile web of obligations that held society together. And once that breach appeared, annulments, betrayals, and scandals rushed through like floodwaters. Royal honeymoons carried a weight unlike any other. For peasants, failure meant gossip and humiliation. For nobles, it meant scandal and annulment. But for kings and queens, the stakes were nothing less than dynasties, alliances, and the stability of realms. A royal honeymoon was not a private retreat into affection, but a stage upon which the future of nations was decided. And when those honeymoons went wrong, or even when they went too well, they shaped the course of history. Consider the marriage of Richard II of England to Isabella of Valois in 1396. Richard was 29 years old. Isabella was just 6. Their union was meant to seal peace between England and France after years of conflict, but consummation was impossible. The very idea of a honeymoon in such circumstances was grotesque, yet still the marriage was performed, and Isabella was sent to England as Richard's queen. Chroniclers remarked that Richard treated her with unusual gentleness, more like a daughter than a wife. But the absence of consummation left the union fragile, vulnerable to future disputes. When Richard was later deposed, Isabella's unconsummated marriage allowed her to be remarried to another king, shifting alliances yet again. The so-called honeymoon that never was became a hinge upon which wars and treaties turned. Not all royal honeymoons were deferred. Some were conducted under such pressure that failure became immediate scandal. Take the union of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves in 1540. Though technically just beyond our medieval time frame, it stands as a vivid example of how expectations could ruin a royal honeymoon. Henry found Anne physically unappealing, famously declaring he could not consummate the marriage. Within 6 months, the marriage was annulled, justified by non-consummation. The scandal humiliated Anne, branded Henry as erratic, and reshaped England's political alliances. Behind it all lay one failed honeymoon bed. Earlier centuries offer similar stories, though often shrouded in rumor. When Louis VII of France married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1137, their honeymoon was watched closely. Louis, pious and awkward, seemed ill-suited to his brilliant, worldly bride. The union was consummated, but their lack of harmony was evident almost immediately. Chroniclers later remarked that Eleanor complained bitterly about Louis's inexperience and coldness. Their marriage eventually collapsed after years of childless frustration, ending in annulment. Eleanor's remarriage to Henry II of England altered the political map of Europe, transferring Aquitaine into English hands and setting the stage for centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. all because a honeymoon revealed incompatibility that no crown could conceal. Royal honeymoons were rarely romantic, but they were often spectacular. In 1469, when Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon, their union would eventually birth the Spanish monarchy that launched Columbus and expelled the Moors. Their honeymoon, unlike many others, was reported as successful, full of affection, mutual respect, and genuine partnership. Their consummation secured not just a marriage, but a dynastic powerhouse. Chroniclers celebrated their union as blessed, and for once the scrutiny of the honeymoon produced joy rather than scandal. Yet even in this case, the public performance mattered as much as the private act. Their partnership was carefully displayed, their unity showcased to reassure subjects that Spain's future was secure. Royal honeymoons also exposed the fragility of child brides, forced into unions long before their bodies were ready. Margaret Beaufort, who would later become the mother of Henry VII of England, was married at the age of 12 to Edmund Tudor. She was expected to conceive immediately. Their honeymoon produced a pregnancy that nearly killed her. She gave birth at 13, her body permanently damaged. Margaret bore no other children, but her survival and the child she delivered altered the fate of England. Her son, Henry, became the first Tudor king, ending the Wars of the Roses. A brutal honeymoon, forced upon a child, became the foundation of a dynasty. Sometimes the scandal of a royal honeymoon lay not in its failure, but in its success. When a queen conceived too quickly, suspicion arose. Was the child truly her husband's? Had intimacy begun before marriage? When Edward IV of England secretly married Elizabeth Woodville in 1464, their honeymoon was immediate and passionate. But their haste caused scandal. Edward had bypassed noble alliances, choosing a commoner for love or lust. Their consummation, though fruitful, undermined his political position. Elizabeth's fertility produced heirs, but also enemies. The honeymoon that should have strengthened his reign instead triggered decades of conflict, culminating in the rise of Richard III and the eventual Tudor conquest. Elsewhere in Europe, tales of bizarre royal honeymoons circulated as cautionary legends. In Bohemia, it was said that one king fainted on his wedding night, too overcome by nerves to approach his bride. His enemies spread rumors of impotence, and though he fathered children later, the shadow of that honeymoon haunted his reign. In France, whispers persisted that certain queens employed magic to secure fertility on their wedding nights, resorting to potions and charms when their husbands faltered. These tales reveal how deeply the medieval imaginations entwined sexuality, politics, and superstition, turning honeymoons into arenas of myth as much as reality. In truth, every royal honeymoon was both a private ordeal and a public event. Chroniclers recorded them, poets adorned them, enemies mocked them. Success meant stability, heirs, and strength. Failure meant annulments, wars, and dynastic collapse. The stakes were so high that some monarchs staged their honeymoons like theatrical performances, ensuring witnesses could testify to success. Curtains were drawn back, sheets examined, rumors silenced. The bed became a battlefield no less critical than any field of war, for from it sprang the legitimacy of rulers and the continuation of lines. What we see, across these stories, is the extraordinary weight placed on the bodies of young men and women, sometimes scarcely more than children. A moment of intimacy, or its absence, could shift borders, ignite wars, topple dynasties, we call them honeymoons, but in the medieval world they were crucibles, testing not just two individuals, but the stability of entire realms. Whether they ended in scandal, triumph, or tragedy, royal honeymoons remind us that history itself was sometimes written in whispers behind bedroom doors. If the marriage bed was a crucible for dynasties, then the church was the forge in which legitimacy was hammered into shape. No medieval honeymoon escaped the shadow of ecclesiastical authority. Priests, bishops, and even popes wielded immense influence over whether a marriage was valid, whether a consummation had truly taken place, and whether the whispers of scandal would be smothered or amplified. In a world where spiritual and political power were inseparable, the church became both witness and judge to the most private of acts. The medieval church insisted that a marriage was not complete until consummation. Words alone, no matter how solemnly spoken at the altar, were not enough. Flesh had to confirm what vows had promised. This gave priests an uncomfortable but powerful role in the affairs of newlyweds. On many occasions, the church acted as arbiter when questions of consummation arose, demanding testimony from servants, confessions from the couple, or in some cases, examinations of the body. It was intrusive, humiliating, and yet considered essential to the sanctity of a marriage. Without consummation, a marriage could be annulled, alliances dissolved, and heirs declared illegitimate. In noble and royal circles, the church's involvement was particularly conspicuous. Marriages between dynasties were contracts as much as unions, and the clergy ensured those contracts were fulfilled. Chroniclers record instances where bishops were invited to bless the bedchamber, where prayers were said over the sheets, and where attendants hovered close enough to hear the sounds of consummation. These rituals were not only religious, they were political theater, designed to leave no doubt in the minds of observers that the union was both sacred and binding. The church also dictated the timing and conditions of honeymoons. Certain holy days and seasons, such as Lent or Advent, were declared inappropriate for consummation. A couple married just before Lent might find themselves forbidden to engage until weeks later, frustrating families eager for swift heirs. Other rules prohibited intimacy in churches or monasteries on Sundays, or during menstruation, and even advised against excessive enjoyment. Manuals written by confessors cautioned couples to avoid positions deemed unseemly, warning that lustful behavior within marriage was still sinful if divorced from the purpose of procreation. It was a delicate balance. Pleasure was tolerated only insofar as it produced children. Anything more strayed dangerously close to sin. Scandal arose when these rules were broken. If a couple conceived suspiciously fast after a prohibited holy day, accusations flew. Had they disobeyed the church's calendar? If a king seemed too passionate with his queen, confessors whispered about excess. Even the faintest rumor of impropriety could become a weapon in the hands of rivals. The church, intentionally or not, provided the language and framework for these attacks. Accusations of sin were often indistinguishable from accusations of political incompetence. Priests and bishops themselves were not immune to scandal. Some were accused of being too involved in the honeymoons they oversaw. Stories circulated of clerics lingering too long in the bridal chamber, of confessors who became confidants in marital intimacy, even of outright corruption where the church accepted bribes to certify consummation that never occurred. These accounts, whether exaggerated or not, reveal how central the Church had become in policing the honeymoon bed. Its authority stretched into the most intimate corners of life, and where there was authority, there was also suspicion. At times, papal rulings decided the fate of entire kingdoms through questions of consummation. When King Louis VII of France sought to annul his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, it was the Church that judged their union defective. Officially, the claim rested on consanguinity, but rumors about their failed intimacy were whispered in cloisters and courts alike. The annulment paved the way for Eleanor to marry Henry II of England, redrawing the map of European power. The Church's judgment on what had or had not transpired in a bedchamber altered the course of centuries. Even ordinary people felt the weight of this oversight. A peasant couple could be dragged before a church court if neighbors doubted their consummation. In some cases, women declared barren were forced to undergo humiliating inspections. Men accused of impotence had to prove their virility before clerical judges. One notorious practice involved the so-called congressus interruptus, where a man accused of impotence was ordered to demonstrate his ability to perform in front of witnesses. If he failed, his wife could be granted annulment. Such scenes blurred the line between justice and cruelty, transforming private struggles into public humiliation. The Church also supplied the rituals that turned honeymoons into spectacles of legitimacy. In some regions, priests blessed the marriage bed with holy water. Hymns were sung as the couple entered their chamber. Candles were left burning, symbolizing divine light shining upon the union. These practices blurred devotion and voyeurism, ensuring that a honeymoon was never merely private. It was sanctified, supervised, and judged according to the standards of faith. Ironically, even as the Church sought to regulate honeymoons, popular culture often mocked its interference. Jokes about priests peering through keyholes or bishops collecting bed linens became staples of medieval humor. Fablio, the ribald tales told at feasts, often portrayed clergy as hypocrites, eager to condemn others' pleasures while indulging secretly themselves. These stories reveal a tension. People recognized the necessity of the Church's authority, but they also resented its intrusion. Perhaps the greatest irony lies in how the Church's obsession with consummation often heightened the very scandal it sought to prevent. By demanding witnesses, inspections, and judgments, it amplified rumors, fed gossip, and ensured that every royal honeymoon became a matter of public debate. Instead of settling disputes, the Church's involvement often fueled them. A king could be branded impotent, a queen accused of adultery, and entire dynasties shaken because ecclesiastical judges insisted on turning whispers into official declarations. For all its flaws, the Church's role reflects the medieval belief that marriage was never just about two individuals. It was a sacred bond with consequences for families, communities, and nations. The honeymoon was not merely the start of married life. It was a ritual of cosmic importance, binding souls as well as bodies, with the Church as guardian of both. But in trying to sanctify the private, the Church made it political. In trying to police passion, it ensured that passion and its failures would echo through history. And so, when we speak of forbidden medieval honeymoons, we cannot separate scandal from sanctity. The Church stood watch over every bed, its presence both blessing and burden. Without its oversight, marriages could not stand. With its oversight, marriages could collapse under scrutiny. In this tension lies the strange, haunting legacy of the medieval honeymoon. Never entirely private, never entirely free, always caught between love, politics, and the gaze of God's representatives on earth. If medieval honeymoons were meant to seal alliances and confirm the sacred bond of matrimony, then their failure could unleash consequences far more devastating than a broken heart. A failed honeymoon meant whispers in the corridors of power, mockery in the chronicles, and sometimes outright war. Across Europe, broken honeymoons left behind a trail of annulments, betrayals, and dynasties undone. What was supposed to be the first step toward stability instead became the beginning of collapse. One of the most infamous broken honeymoons occurred in the 13th century, when John, King of England, married Isabella of Angoulême. Their marriage was a political coup for John, who snatched Isabella away from her previous betrothal to a powerful French nobleman. But though the union was consummated with haste and enthusiasm, it backfired spectacularly. The spurned noble raised rebellion, the French king declared war, and England lost vast territories. The honeymoon had done its duty in the narrowest sense, but the scandal of how it came about poisoned relations for decades. What was supposed to be a union of strength instead became a curse, ushering in political disasters that defined John's troubled reign. Other honeymoons ended in humiliation when annulments followed too swiftly. In 1200, Philip II of France married Ingeborg of Denmark, but within a day he declared himself repulsed by her and sought annulment. Chroniclers say the queen wept at the altar, bewildered by the sudden rejection. Philip claimed the marriage was invalid due to consanguinity, though many suspected he simply found her unattractive. The church resisted his annulment for years, forcing Philip into a scandalous limbo where he kept other mistresses while still technically married. His rejection of Ingeborg became one of the most publicized broken honeymoons of the age, eroding his reputation and weakening his authority. Annulments were often justified by accusations of non-consummation, and this gave rise to one of the most humiliating rituals of medieval life, the public investigation of a couple's first night together. A noble marriage could be annulled if the bride or groom claimed the act had never taken place. This required testimony, sometimes medical examination, and occasionally the involvement of clerics who were far too eager to judge the matter. In 1314, a scandal shook France when 3 daughters-in-law of King Philip IV were accused of adultery. Their husbands insisted that their marriages had failed long before, citing issues of consummation and fidelity. The broken honeymoons spiraled into treason trials, executions, and the disintegration of the Capetian line. A failure to secure private harmony became a public catastrophe, remembered as the Tour de Nesle affair. In England, Edward II's disastrous marriage to Isabella of France was haunted by rumors from the start. Edward was deeply attached to his favorite, Piers Gaveston, and it was said that he neglected his new queen during their honeymoon in 1308. While the marriage was eventually consummated and produced heirs, the insult of a neglected honeymoon festered. Isabella grew resentful, their union turned poisonous, and she ultimately allied with her lover, Roger Mortimer, to overthrow Edward. What began as a honeymoon scandal ended with the king deposed, imprisoned, and almost certainly murdered. Sometimes, honeymoons ended not with annulments, but with bitter disappointment that echoed through generations. When Margaret of Scotland married Eric II of Norway in the 13th century, their honeymoon was described in chronicles as cold and loveless. Margaret was said to despise the climate and the king's rough manners. Their union produced no heirs, and Margaret died young, her legacy little more than a footnote in Norway's history. A marriage designed to unite kingdoms fizzled out in bitterness, its failure symbolic of the distance between political arrangements and human happiness. Even when consummation occurred, scandal could bloom if pregnancy failed to follow. A barren honeymoon was often blamed on the woman, leading to accusations of witchcraft, hidden sin, or divine punishment. Queens who failed to conceive after their honeymoons faced relentless pressure. Catherine of Aragon's early years with Henry VIII illustrate this vividly. Their honeymoon was long, their union devoted, yet miscarriages and stillbirths followed. Each failed pregnancy was seen not only as a private sorrow, but as a political disaster. The shadow of those early failures eventually gave Henry justifications, at least in his mind, to annul the marriage decades later. But it was not only women who bore the brunt of failed honeymoons. Men accused of impotence found their reputations shattered. In some cases, entire councils of clerics and nobles were assembled to test whether a king or noble was capable of consummation. The humiliation was profound, the gossip endless, and the political stakes enormous. In late medieval Castile, whispers about royal impotence undermined kings who struggled to command respect. A failed honeymoon could strip a ruler of authority more effectively than defeat in battle. The spectacle of annulments also revealed how fragile the concept of love and desire was in a world ruled by alliances. When a honeymoon went wrong, no amount of personal affection or lack thereof could disguise the damage. Kings and queens became pawns of their bodies, their private disappointments fueling wars and reshaping borders. The annulment of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine, the rejection of Ingeborg by Philip II, the cold disdain of Margaret in Norway was a personal fracture with continental consequences. Broken honeymoons also fed popular rumor and legend. Tales of impotent kings, frigid queens, and loveless marriages circulated in taverns and marketplaces, becoming moral lessons as much as gossip. These stories reminded ordinary people of the fragility of power. A king might command armies, but if he failed in the bedchamber, his kingdom trembled. A queen might be dressed in jewels, but if she failed to bear an heir, her crown grew heavy with shame. What is most striking is how swiftly a single night or the perception of it could define an entire reign. A king humiliated on his honeymoon might spend years trying to prove his virility. A queen scorned on her first night might transform from consort to enemy. A barren union could haunt courts for decades, becoming the seedbed of civil wars. Scandal clung to these broken honeymoons not because they were rare, but because they cut to the core of what medieval society demanded: heirs, alliances, and appearances of harmony. When honeymoons faltered, the consequences rippled far beyond the marriage bed. They toppled kings, fueled wars, and altered the destinies of nations. Behind the silks, the candles, and the carefully staged rituals lay a truth that no dynasty could escape. Failure was public, success was fragile, and scandal was inevitable. A honeymoon was supposed to be a beginning, but for too many medieval couples, it became the start of an ending. When we look back across the centuries at these strange and often tragic honeymoons, what lingers most is not the romance or the passion, but the sheer weight placed on the most fragile and private moments of life. A medieval honeymoon was never simply a retreat for two people. It was a stage on which kingdoms rose and fell, a contract sealed not with ink but with flesh, and a crucible where personal hopes collided with political necessity. And because of this, the line between intimacy and scandal was always razor thin. The legacy of these forbidden or broken honeymoons is both haunting and oddly familiar. Again and again, we see the same pattern: the bedroom transformed into a battlefield, the body turned into a weapon of politics. Kings judged by their virility, queens judged by their fertility, dynasties balanced precariously on the tremors of a single night. For modern readers, the absurdity is almost unbearable. That a marriage could be declared void because witnesses doubted whether a man and woman had properly done their duty. That sheets could be displayed as evidence, stained or unstained, as though they alone carried the fate of nations. That whispers of failure, impotence, or premature passion could ignite wars more surely than any clash of armies. And yet beneath the absurdity lies something recognizably human. Behind the heavy veils of ritual, the processions, the watchful clergy, and the rumors, there were still individuals. Nervous brides, sometimes scarcely past childhood, awkward grooms, sometimes overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment, couples forced into unions they did not want, expected to display joy while feeling dread. Others who perhaps found unexpected tenderness, even love, despite the weight of politics pressing upon them. These were not just symbols, but people. And while chroniclers recorded their scandals with glee, the silences between the lines remind us of fear, longing, and the private negotiations of affection that history rarely preserves. The medieval imagination elevated honeymoons into something almost mythic. Stories of kings who fainted at the sight of their brides, of queens who enchanted their husbands with potions, of noble couples whose failure to consummate their marriage became the stuff of legend. Ballads and fabliaux poked fun at nervous grooms, while moralists thundered against excess in the marriage bed. Even when a honeymoon succeeded, suspicion lingered. Was the bride too eager? Was the groom too restrained? Every gesture could be interpreted, every silence filled with rumor. In this way, honeymoons became not only historical events but cultural parables, lessons in morality, warnings against lust, or tales of divine punishment. At the heart of it all was the church, weaving sanctity and surveillance into the fabric of marriage. Its obsession with consummation ensured that no honeymoon was ever entirely private. And yet the Church's involvement also preserved the memory of these nights, inscribing them into law, record, and rumor. Without the Church's judgments, we might not know about Eleanor of Aquitaine's dissatisfaction, Philip of France's rejection of Ingeborg, or the countless annulments justified by the failure of consummation. Ironically, the very institution that sought to guard the sanctity of the marital bed ensured its scandals were preserved for eternity. What do these stories reveal about love in the Middle Ages? Not that it was absent, but that it was forced to survive in hostile conditions. Many couples grew to love one another despite arranged marriages, political pressures, and the heavy gaze of family and clergy. Some found comfort in partnership, shared burdens, and the slow building of trust. Others never found harmony at all, their unions defined by coldness, betrayal, or violence. The honeymoon was simply the beginning, And whatever it revealed, whether tenderness or disaster, tended to shape the course of a lifetime. For us, the fascination lies in the intimacy of the scandal. Wars and treaties are often dry to read about, but the image of a nervous king, fumbling in candlelight, or a young queen terrified by the expectations placed upon her, these are scenes that cut through time. They remind us that history was lived by people with bodies, fears, and desires, that the great events of the medieval world were sometimes shaped not by swords on battlefields, but by whispers behind curtains, that the future of kingdoms could depend on whether two people felt warmth, dread, or nothing at all during a single night. The legacy of forbidden medieval honeymoons lingers too in our language. We still speak of the honeymoon as a blissful period of intimacy and discovery. But beneath that modern romance is the shadow of its medieval origins, when the honeymoon was a test, a ritual, and often a trap. The word itself recalls honey and moon sweetness and cycles, but in practice it often meant pressure, performance, and the looming threat of scandal. The medieval honeymoon was less about bliss than about survival. Survival of alliances, survival of dynasties, survival of reputation. And yet, perhaps there is comfort in recognizing how absurd it all was. That kingdoms rose and fell on whether or not a groom was nervous or whether a bride concealed her dread. That sheets were paraded as evidence in courts of law. That songs were written about failures in the marriage bed. It is absurd and yet deeply human. It reminds us that even the grandest figures in history, kings, queens, nobles, were caught in the same awkward web of desire, fear, and expectation that shapes ordinary lives. Their scandals were larger, their consequences greater, but their hearts beat with the same uncertainties as ours. As we close this journey through forbidden honeymoons, we see not just the scandals, but the humanity. The trembling hands, the whispered doubts, the fragile hopes that sometimes flourished and sometimes broke under the weight of expectation. And we see how history itself was shaped not only by armies and crowns, but by the smallest of moments, the fumbling of a nervous groom, the sigh of a disappointed bride, the quiet triumph of a couple who found unexpected tenderness in the midst of spectacle. The medieval honeymoon was never only about love. It was about survival, politics, scandal, and the gaze of the world. But through all the absurdity, there was still something tender, something unmistakably human. And if we listen closely to the whispers of those long-ago nights, muffled by centuries of rumor and judgment, perhaps what we hear is not only scandal, but also a simple truth. That love, however fragile, however forbidden, still tried to bloom, even in the coldest chambers of history,